Hello, everybody. It is Sunday, September the 8th, 2024. Earlier this week, we did a show with the Australian politician and economist Andrew Leigh on economics. He's also a PhD from Harvard in economics, and he has a new book out, How Economics Explains the World, A Short History of Humanity. I have to admit, whilst it was an interesting interview, I didn't quite understand everything he was saying. Economics, of course, is about our motivation as human beings. And my conversation with Andrew Leigh was, I think, a little bit theoretical. We're getting very practical, though, today in terms of economics. What drives us to do things? I think that's what economics is all about. And what doesn't drive us to do things. My guest today has been on the show before. Is a journalist in New York, Rafil Kroll-Zaidi, and he has a new piece out on, in its own way, economics. It's called Among the Idlers. It's a piece about about his own experience in making six figures by reporting idling trucks. He's joining us from, appropriately enough, New York City. Rafil, what drove you to do this weird thing of reporting idling trucks?
Well, part of the appeal was very likely that it was weird. I saw a tweet a few years ago about this program, and it seemed not quite too good to be true, but the sort of thing that is exactly good enough to be true. Asterisk, because there's something very funny about it. It reminded me very nearly, or most nearly, I guess, maybe not that similar, but the closest thing in my experience is that pastime that allows just regular citizens under federal law to seek monetary damages. I think you would actually have to sue to do this from telemarketers who call in spite of your being on the do not call registry. So if you can get them to out with who they really are, then you don't have to go all the way to sue them, but you send a demand letter and say, look here, you've broken the law, and I could come after you in civil court.
Well, okay, well, you're getting too much into the weeds.
I won't get
Let's get down to basics. I gave the introduction on why we do things, and your piece is about how to make six figures by reporting idling trucks. Is that true? Were you making six figures in New York City reporting idling trucks?
Yes. So there's,
and that's 600. So that's over $100,000 a year.
That's what it means. And there's a group of people who do this part-time, or a very few of them full-time, who make comparable amounts.
So basically, so there are idling trucks. So these are trucks that are stopped, that still have their engines on, and they get reported in New York City. And the people who report them make over $100,000 a year. So before we get to the details of the program, why were you doing it? Purely for money?
It wasn't purely for money. I think I have in common with the other very dedicated part-timers or full-timers who do this, that there was some sort of neurotic satisfaction to getting the law enforced in one area very reliably. If there's a building violation where they're doing dangerous work or work on the weekend, if you call an inspector, by the time the city actually shows up, the violation is long gone. There's no way to hold anyone to account.
Great, and we all, I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but my own experience is I would love to get people fined in San Francisco. So many people double park, they break violations of one kind or another. It would give me great satisfaction, moral satisfaction rather than financial, and getting them fined, punished. But you're suggesting that you can do both. You can get both moral and financial satisfaction by reporting idling trucks.
Yes, and you don't have to be in a very special way an aggrieved party here, where you take someone to small claims court because, say, their company has idled persistently outside your residence or something like that. This is open to all natural persons, which is a pretty broad category, and you can turn in buses or trucks that idle illegally.
And how do you prove it? How can they can they just switch their engines off and say, well, you're wrong?
Well, I think because of that very possibility, the standard for proof has risen. When the city rolled this out about 5 years ago, the law had been on the books for some time, but there was no formal program for accepting these complaints. So when they initiated a formal program for accepting complaints, all you had to do was sign an affidavit, and then someone could say, "Well, I wasn't there that day." End of story. Then they moved over to a video standard. So as long as the video is any good, it's very hard for a respondent to claim our fleet was nowhere near there.
So you carry your iPhone around, you video this idling truck, and we got this great image from Curbed, which is a New York a New York offshoot of New Yorker magazine, and that proves that they were doing what you said they were doing, and they get fined, and you get your cut.
If only it were exactly that simple. But yes,
okay, but that's all the theory.
Yeah.
So I've got this wonderful image. It's a sort of, it's almost like Repo Man, which I saw recently, that classic American movie. I can imagine guys like you, Rafil, wandering around New York trying to report these idling trucks. Is that the case? Would you just wander around all day, sit outside cafes waiting for the truck to come along, and then you'd photograph them or video them, and you'd pay for your coffee and your lunch?
I've excused myself from a dinner or a lunch before and said, "Hang on, I'll pay. Just give me 4 minutes or so." And that's exactly what happens.
Delicious. You never pay. I'll have to catch you next time I'm in New York, although you're not doing it anymore. And how many people actually do this? And how did you find out about it?
I am actually still doing it.
Oh, you are?
So come anytime, you're welcome. And as long as we sit on near a busy thoroughfare, I'll stand you to a lunch. So I do it part-time, and I would say there are probably at this stage 5 or 6 dozen other fairly prolific part-timers who submit at least 1,000 complaints a year to the city. So 1,000 distinct idling complaints. Then there are very few full-timers, maybe barely over one hand's worth, who are incredibly productive. I mean, some of them are less productive than the most productive part-timers, but the whole community of people who are really into it, really gung-ho and highly productive, still at this point probably well under 100 people.
Well, Rafil, for people who are just listening, you look a little bit of a hipster. You've been on the show before. You also you wrote this wonderful piece for Harper's on Branson, Missouri, a very long piece. I think it's the longest piece Harper's has ever run. So you have a hipsterish quality. Do most of your colleagues and the other idlers, are they also of hipster quality? Do you, as you report these idlers, then you run into your local vinyl store and buy a record, or buy an expensive cup of coffee?
I abhor expensive coffee, but I am artsier than most of my cohort. You're certainly right in that. Many of them are sort of holders of advanced postgraduate degrees. Lawyers are
surprise, probably PhDs in philosophy from Columbia or NYU, right? Having spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on their education, now they're paying it back by reporting idlers.
And many of them are employed full time, so lawyer by day, and then not exactly idling reporter by night, but idling reporter also by day during the lunch break or before work, that kind of thing.
So they're a kind of, this is the new precariat. Are they a happy group? Are they complaining all the time? Are they having fun?
I think their idling work is precarious. They complain all the time and they have fun, so it's both. I would say that the weird irony of this program is that it does attract people who are financially motivated as well as environmentally motivated, and the two tend to sort of start to run together. The financially motivated get really into the environmental stakes, and the environmentally motivated wind up finding the money rather a nice incentive. But in order to do this, you sometimes wait so long to get paid and have to uh, move through the bureaucracy with such finesse to get fully up to speed that you can't do it if you're living hand to mouth. You have to have a day job that's very stable, or a partner with a proper job and insurance. So strangely enough, it's the precariat who can't yet participate because it's a little too uncertain at any given point how and when this is going to pay out.
And then, of course, and we're going to get to this because it's not a perfect program on any level, from any perspective. You have to deal with the New York local bureaucracy. All bureaucracies are bad. I'm guessing that the New York metropolitan bureaucracy is probably worse than average, is it?
I mean, my most intimate point of comparison is with India, so I actually have to let New York City off the hook a little too easily, perhaps, because I've seen I've stared into the abyss, and
yeah, so it's better than doing this. I'm guessing there are no programs like this in India because every truck stalls in India.
But mostly in traffic. I think you wouldn't sit around just running the truck for the AC in India because petrol's too precious. So there's an interesting thing, and there's an interesting thing there where it has to happen in an economy where you don't really think about the extra fuel cost or vehicle wear, and whether someone's a union driver or running or sort of a one-person operation, things like that. All of these minute things you start to notice feed into driver behavior. So the more expert you get in idling reporting, the more you start to see these fine distinctions.
You're a literary fellow, Rafil, so I'm guessing there is a Baudelairean quality to this. If Baudelaire was around today, he might take up the profession and written something like you. Is this what urban hipsters do these days, to make sense of the city?
I mean, the Baudelaire comparison is beyond kind. Thank you, but I think this has attracted a variety of people who want a little bit of a stake in the system, want some sense of control over things. One of the people I do a sort of mini profile of in the piece, Mike, who's a recently retired NYPD detective, was trying to report trucks not for idling but for jamming up his home residential block overnight, just sitting there, sleeping in the cabs, doing things like that. And he couldn't get any traction, ironically, from the police department, even though you'd think he'd be a little bit well connected. And one of his former colleagues, I think it was, said to him, you can get them if they're idling. That's what you get them for. So it was this way in to actually exert some leverage.
Revenge. I'm guessing that this, given how truck drivers tend to be, I don't want to generalize about truck drivers because I'll get into trouble, but they tend to be perhaps bulkier than average and sometimes a little violent. Does this sometimes degenerate into violence because they're going to get fined? They know exactly what's happening.
That fortunately doesn't happen very often at all. I have at this point recorded well over 4,000 complaints, I think, and I've never been credibly threatened. I've had only a few people exchange words with me or address me in any way.
They didn't threaten you and say, if you book me, I'm going to smack you in the nose?
No, but I'm also very, very subtle, and I try to avoid conflict and confrontation. One of the other three people I do the mini profiles of is Patrick, who's a German pediatrician, and I follow him around, and in so doing realize that he is the opposite. He's really aggressive, partly because he wants to let people know that he's on to them.
Yeah, so he has
And
well, I don't want to make any generalizations about Germans, but there are other compatriots of his who've done the same thing historically.
Germans are a bit overrepresented in this program, and
Oh,
and
yeah.
and then when their German friends visit New York, they're very charmed by the idling complaint program, and some of them even submit complaints. I don't think they can actually claim the money because of
So you said you booked for 4,000 complaints. How much do you make per complaint?
it varies enormously because
Well, on average. Oh, it varies. Why?
well, whether it's a first, second, or third violation, you're cut as a percentage.
So you
So
don't know when you're doing the booking.
you don't know if they'll pay, just given which company it is.
So you
You could
don't get
do
a cut if they don't pay.
you don't get a cut if they don't pay, and that's one of the reasons it can take so long to get paid. Is that
Oh my God.
if the city just said this looks good and we'll give you your percentage now, even if it were a lower percentage, I think many more people would do this.
And you trust the city because this sounds to me like the opportunity for the city not to pay. They can claim they haven't paid. You can't prove they paid, can you?
They're pretty good. I mean, the open data system in New York for this kind of fine is pretty well managed and centrally managed. So I don't think they would have an easy way to fudge just this one thing. And it's win-win. They make 3 times as much money as the citizen. The citizen gets a 25% cut.
Right.
And
The win-win. I like that. That's an economic term. And you call them citizens. Of course, they're citizen activists. I mean, that's the fair way of putting it, isn't it? They're doing good and they're making money at the same time.
that's the hope.
And just to come back before we get to the practicality of this, it's not quite as win-win as in practice as it is in theory. On average, I know that's a hard one, but on average, how much would you make per complaint if it came through, if it was paid?
So I'll try to talk in slightly more general terms than just myself, because the numbers also vary from person to person. I submit what are essentially protest complaints, as do a few other people I know. So, for example, if they see a government vehicle idling, some of these people will, even knowing that the Department of Environmental Protection will refuse to accept the complaint, feel that there's an obligation to report this, or in the hopes that some appellate decision will come down, which will retroactively legitimize some complaints that were on shaky ground. So I would say the average per complaint for, depending on who you are and where you do it, and so on and so forth, could be anywhere from $60 to $100. And the
Well, pay for
videos,
a decent lunch for you and a friend on the curbside as you're reporting these idling trucks. So, is there an element, you mentioned citizen activists? Is there an element of citizen virtue here? Is it a communitarian culture or a communitarian spirit here which is driving people?
I think there's a great deal of camaraderie, and that's among the people who do it. There's also a broader sense of commitment to some of these communities. Sometimes people who don't want to go through all of the complexities of getting up to speed on the program will ask for volunteers to come to their neighborhoods and do the reporting, and essentially drive down the idling in that area, with a reward, in terms of their own self-interest. I've also volunteered with a nonprofit in a community that had very, very little reporting going on, and very bad air and very bad behavior by trucking companies generally. So there's some sense of obligation to the rest of our number who do this sort of semi-professionally, as well as to New York at large. And if people want to become involved, or want us to do community outreach. Generally, those of us who are in contact with each other, there's some people who do this completely off the radar, no one knows who they are, but those of us who are part of a sort of an activist community will do our best to bring new people into the fold, whether they be whatever.
The curbed visual for the piece among the idlers has an image of Superman and then of a private dick, which is more appropriate. I mean, what do you dress? Do you dress normally, Rafil? Do you have a special uniform so you can recognize each other? Do you want to be as anonymous as you possibly can?
You want to be as anonymous as you possibly can, and you want your phone to blend into your body and the rest of your kit if possible. So you don't want to stand out in any way. Although I do sometimes don a disguise. That's if I'm.
What's the disguise?
One thing or another. One of them is an Amazon delivery uniform.
Oh, that's clever.
Mm-hmm. And
although, wouldn't you get into trouble for that?
No, I mean, I'm not. I'm not trying to enter anyone's building. I'm not sort of bringing disrepute.
I'm sure you'd get sued by Amazon if they knew you were wearing their uniforms and making your own money by reporting idling trucks,
including very often Amazon itself.
That's pretty ironic.
Yeah.
Who are the worst? The worst idlers? Are they UPS drivers? Amazon drivers, tow-away trucks?
It's funny that you should have mentioned repo men earlier. They're really bad. The stealth repo tow trucks.
Oh, the repo guys?
Yeah, the hook is hidden in the bed of a sort of regular-looking pickup truck, so you don't see them coming. They're generally very, very badly behaved. But
well, they were very badly behaved in the movie too. It's a great movie.
It is a great movie. UPS are except at Christmas when they bring in non-union guys, they're very disciplined. They very rarely idle.
So I always feel sorry for the UPS guys because it's a hard job. Are they required to switch their trucks off when they double park to drop in a package?
Since 9/11, all of the UPS trucks, I believe, have had a fair amount of advanced telemetry. So you don't want to do. I mean, they get parking tickets all the time, but they're very disciplined about turning off. I've talked to a few UPS guys, and they've had different stories as to why they're so disciplined. Some say they learned from the union that they're just supposed to switch it off. And actually, their trucks are not air conditioned, so they have very little incentive to leave it on when it's hot. Because
it's a tough. I always feel rather sorry, although I think they're reasonably well paid. I was in New York last week, Rafil, and I got as I always do in New York, a Mr. Whippy from an ice cream van. Can you nail them if they don't turn their engines off? That would be rather cruel, wouldn't it?
What you're hearing on the ice cream trucks are almost always secondary engines, and those are unfortunately very, very polluting, but it has to be the engine that moves the vehicle, and the ice cream guys are pretty good about keeping their main engines off.
Good, because you don't want to ruin kids' lives by putting ice cream trucks out of business, and then there'll be no ice cream on the street. I'm guessing that the most moral satisfaction you would get is from tow-away trucks. Everybody hates tow-away trucks. Is that fair?
I don't know. It's the most moral satisfaction generally comes from any company that's ever wronged you, and that varies from person to person.
So what about for you? What company has wronged you?
City Bike, which is now Lyft. So I go out of my way to get them. So rather than
why? What have they done wrong?
Oh, I mean, this is a petty thing, but they didn't adhere to the terms of the written contract that they had about being able to suspend one's account. I mean, it's a little bit of a joke. I'm not sort of set on dinging them as hard as I can. But there are certain businesses that just operate with a lot of shady habits and impunity. I would say the waste carting industry is definitely one. So you
Or
see them
what
do.
about the recyclers? They're doing a good job. What about the other way? Do you sometimes feel bad, a recycling van or someone presumably trying to do some sort of good?
I think I mean, it's funny that you should ask that, because one of the most interesting cases of elaborate countermeasures I've heard of among the, and idlers sort of cuts both ways. There's been this kind of semantic drift where we use it to refer to ourselves and our activity as idling, but then idling and idlers are, of course, the things that the vehicles and the respondents themselves are doing. But the Salvation Army, which is
Yeah, that would be brutal, Raphael.
they're a charity, but they are the local one in downtown Brooklyn. Their drivers have traditionally been very bad about idling, and rather than simply switching off, they posted a lookout, and so that rather than simply turning off the engine, the driver of the day could be
Did you have
warned.
with a Salvation Army truck? Would you have moral scruples and think to yourself, okay, the driver hasn't switched his engine off, but I really don't want to find these people. They're doing good.
I think the scruples come in here and there, but I think they come in different ways. I think the Salvation Army is a bloated, not particularly well run charity.
Well, it's better than Amazon.com.
Better than Amazon, but the scruples come in more in situations like if there's a mom and pop business that's clearly a single operator, may not know the law, it would certainly be bad form to
it certainly would, Raphael.
Yeah. To record them.
If Wim Wenders is watching, I'm not sure if you saw Wim Wenders' latest film about toilet cleaners in Japan. I love the idea of making a movie about a German pediatrician who is an idler on the side in New York City. There is certainly a cinematic quality to this. We've already talked about Repo Man. This could be the Repo Man for the 2020s. Have you sold the movie rights on the piece?
No, but someone joked the other day before I had published this that Jeff Goldblum was following Patrick the pediatrician around and was set to pay him, and I had to ask for confirmation that it was in fact a joke. So there is a sort of madcap cinematic quality to the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, Jim Jarmusch, lots of urban filmmakers. I don't know if Jarmusch is still around, but Wenders, Jarmusch, that whole school of thought. Okay, so we've idealized it, I think, Raphael. It looks to be, as you called it, as economists describe this, win-win. But win-wins are never win-win, of course. So what's the problem with all this?
Well, there are a few problems. One is that the winners often tend to be those, as I said, who can afford not to get paid for a really long time. So those who are already in positions of relative financial stability and privilege.
It benefits the elite in New York.
And there are people who do this who are a little more precarious, a little more hand to mouth, and they've had to figure out ways to make it work. If it were possible for a broader cross section of the city to submit more easily, get paid more quickly, then this would more rapidly move away from anything resembling a truck tax, basically, and toward the kind of ideal sunsetting scenario of collapsing under the weight of its own success.
But you have competition. You're a sort of a private cowboy service. Are there traffic cops or parking people working for the city who give out parking fines? Can they do the same thing, and do they compete with you?
NYPD, the Department of Environmental Protection, and other agencies can all issue these tickets. They never did it very much before this program came into being, and once the program came into being, ticket written by a traffic cop or a DEP agent out in the field those are hen's teeth. So our only competition is one another. You can write only one summons per vehicle, per location, per day. So if there's cable TV, cable service truck that's sitting in one spot for 10 hours.
Oh, see, yeah, I bet the cable companies are bad at this. Okay, so one problem is it benefits the wealthy, which is probably true of most things. What are the other problems?
I wouldn't say the wealthy, but it benefits
Well, it benefits those who are less precarious than others,
yeah,
who
less
can afford
precarious
to
and
wait
highly
3 months for their income.
Yeah. And the sort of the other ways that it's imperfect, it's very complicated, which also discourages participation. And I think that's partly been by design. The city is a bit overwhelmed dealing with the number of complaints that come in. Last year it was about 88,000 total raw complaints that they received. This year it's set to be in excess of 100,000.
So for your 4,000, that's what, 25 times 4. So there's 25 of you.
24 or 4.5 is my lifetime. Last year I was about 2150 out of 88. So lower
You're
percentage.
a big player here. You're a big idler.
I suppose I am. And I mean, it's funny to hear you say that, because this is a sort of a form of work avoidance for me. But
it is work. You got to walk around with a camera. You got to snap the camera. You got to do the report. I assume it requires some filling in of forms. It must be annoying in some ways.
The filling in of forms is very tedious, and I'm one of a few people who use a back office in India to deal with the most.
Oh my God! So Rafil, so you've got the precariat really working for you. You're working off platforms in India to actually submit your documentation.
They're definitely not the Indian precariat. Some of them are postdoctoral students and things like that. But certainly in a sort of in a PPP sense, they are.
So what does this tell us about you? As I said, you've been on the show before. You wrote a long piece about Branson for Harper's. I know Harper's don't pay very well. You spent months, many thousands of words writing this piece up. I assume you got paid about 5 cents a word. What does this tell us about aspiring young writers, magazine writers, book writers, novelists, nonfiction writers?
Well, it is very hard these days to make a living simply writing magazine pieces. And I suppose for the past couple of years, my other source of income has been this program, idling, and then a little bit of dust complaints for gypsum board being crushed in inappropriate ways and spraying all over the street, that kind of thing. Mostly the idling reporting. And this, so there's a kind of circular quality here, where I'm writing about a thing that I do because art is hard to make a living on, and I'm sort of double dipping, also writing a piece. But the piece here didn't pay that well. I could have spent the time.
Well, as we know, pieces generally, even if it's for New York Magazine, you can turn this into a book, or try to turn it into a book.
Well, I think that for the next generation out there, the only justification for writing long, consuming magazine pieces is probably that you're angling toward some other project, unless you're a staff writer at a place like the New Yorker.
Well, how much does the New Yorker pays pretty well? They pay at least $1, what, $2 or $3
and you have a certain guarantee if you have a staff contract.
Well, the New York Magazine, I assume how much did you get paid for this?
I don't remember the exact amount, but they have a flat rate for features, and it's around $8,000. So
how many complaints would you have to do for this piece to be paid the same?
Not many. I could have. Let me tell you the sort of the reverse of that. If I had spent the time I put into writing this piece simply going around and videoing and submitting complaints, I would have made probably another $100,000 instead of $8,000. So,
wow. So you are a citizen activist. What does this tell us more broadly? We began talking about economics, how economics explains the world, a short history of humanity. Of course, there's a big tradition in behavioral economics of nudge theory. what did you learn from this about getting people to behave themselves better so that they don't idle, they don't drop trash, they don't do things which are antisocial, especially in cities?
You can see the effects coming through slowly but durably, and I think that's because rather than going up and accosting one of the drivers of who's come in with an electric repair truck, or one of the plumbers who's come in, and this is the guy I mentioned briefly who brought this program to life, who's an activist, used to do that before you could really get money out of this. He made up all these business cards. He would go around, hand them out to thousands of people, tell them to stop idling. And that's a very, very tedious and...
Yeah, I'm surprised. How did he convince the New York authorities? I would have thought this would have been a hard thing to actually... It's one thing to have the idea. It's a funny, entertaining, in some ways attractive idea. But convincing conservative bureaucrats to let him do it must have been quite a challenge.
Well, because they're not the ones who needed to be convinced. The law had been on the books for...
Oh, so the law already exists for this particular thing.
And what the new law that he got passed through the council, which tends to be much more progressive, was basically to unhide the program, to make it a bit more accessible, to commit to a certain level of awards for the citizens who turn in the trucks. And the sort of clearly the incentives are drawing citizens in, and the disincentives are slowly but very steadily making their making their impact on these big companies. The fleets in various fleets have been told not to idle. You can talk to the drivers. There are electric conversions going on. And because it's going to corporate, it's not going to the drivers, there's a slower effect, but when it comes in, it's more durable, because it's the money people who are saying, look, this is actually starting to hurt our bottom line.
So nudge economics, in other words, your experience on the street as opposed to being in a university office, nudge theory works. If people are pinched a little bit, they will behave themselves. They will obey the law.
Right, and it's not a huge deal for Amazon to pay $3 million in fines in New York City, but it's also become a little bit embarrassing for them because their name always gets dragged.
Yeah, although I'm sure their financial controllers are not thrilled by it, because $3 million is $3 million.
Yeah, and it's probably well above that at this point. So, yeah, if I can, in a very explicit way, turn your question back to a sort of a matter of self-importance. I hadn't realized this before, but one thing that this has in common with the Branson piece and with the piece that I wrote for Harper's before that, which is about a strange little island where John Travolta until recently lived in Maine, called Islesboro, is that I am very interested in how small communities and cultures are affected by and sort of deformed by monetary incentives. Branson is a sort of cash cow of a town. There's a very strange way that wealth operates in coastal holiday town Maine during the year, and then in the off season, and with all of the sort of the class and income peculiarities that creates. And so I guess I've been, and then now that I think of the other projects that I have on my plate for the future, they're all about odd local subcultures in some way, and all about the way that that money interacts with those odd little subcultures.
Although, aren't you contradicting yourself in the sense that you wouldn't have done this for free, that you were monetarily compensated for this, for reporting the idlers?
Oh, no, I absolutely agree. This is a subculture that would have existed to a much smaller degree were it not for the monetary incentive. I turned build sort of big condo builders in for destroying trees and things like that once in a while, but this is not something that you can waste hours on a day. If
you live, where do you live in New York City?
I live in Brooklyn.
Well, judging from the books and the room behind you. Does this pay for you to live in Brooklyn? I know Brooklyn's an expensive place to live, Rafil.
I mean, I suppose that's true of much of New York City. It's my principal source of income at this point. I actually waited 2 years before requesting any of the money from the program, and part of that was possibly out of some vague sense of journalistic virtue because I was also writing about it. But I actually think the main thing is that this is so
How do you survive?
My partner has a real job, and I do make some amount of money from writing.
And what's your partner do?
She's a private investigator. She also writes. She used to be an academic.
She's a private, so you're quite a team. She's the private investigator who makes more cash, and you're the idler. And do you watch each other? Do you report each other? What happens if you caught her idling?
Well, you can't do a private passenger vehicle. It has to be.
And finally, when is this going to come to San Francisco? There aren't any. I'm not sure when you were last in San Francisco. The police have, for one reason or other, retreated from the streets of San Francisco. So everybody breaks the law. And there are a lot of bad drivers, a lot of people who speed, who don't stop. When can we take this model and turn every local San Francisco person into an idler who can report anyone who breaks the law, especially when it comes to driving?
I suppose that's up to city council there. LA City Council actually are undertaking some sort of feasibility study for using this program as a model to see whether it would work there. And then in New York, there have been some moves toward making something like this work for more dangerous forms of parking violations, parking in front of a hydrant, blocking a bus lane, that kind of thing. Which doesn't seem to get off the ground, but it's an interesting question because it can make up for gaps in enforcement where, for whatever
in a culture where no one trusts the state, where people pay less and less tax, it's one way of, if you like, networking citizenship. I'm sure the internet has all sorts of Web3 style models for this. Well, Rafil Kroll-Zaidi, the author of Among the Idlers, a very brave man to come on and confess to doing what he does. Congratulations on the new piece. It's in Curbed. It's out now. It's, as always with you, very well written. And I will look forward to getting you back on the show. I'm sure your next piece will be equally intriguing and slightly outrageous. Thank you so much, Rafil.
Thanks, Andrew. That's very much what I try for.